Okay, this is the prosecution statement for Bisham Abbey on the charge of being haunted. We spent the night there. We all experienced something, some to more or less degrees than others. However, what I'm going to do is I'm going to present sort of a collation of what we experienced, and you can judge for yourself on balance of the evidence whether you think Bisham Abbey is haunted. Firstly, I would like to say we had a fantastic night, and thank you very much to the Anti-Nolan Trust for allowing us to visit such a fantastic location and giving us the opportunity to work with a medium such as Brian Boyle, who was fantastic on the night, and he came up with a lot of stuff which I will talk about in a minute. Firstly, we're going to talk about the Knights Templar. There is a long history of Knights Templar Association dating back from the 1200s, and this was actually picked up on in a couple of locations. Mostly it seemed to be around the Margaret Dickinson room. During the glass moving, one of the groups picked up on a Knight Templar who was executed from a hanging tree that was located in the grounds of Bisham Abbey. He claimed to have been executed in 1307. If anyone knows anything about the history of the Knights Templar, you'll know what I'm talking about. If not, I'll fill you in. In 1307, the Knights Templar were tried for heresy in France. It was all due to money and loaning money to the King of France and stuff. But they were tried for heresy and excommunicated and executed. So 1307 is a big sort of year for the Knights Templar. But they actually used Bisham Abbey quite a lot before that. Probably not so much after. Another thing that was picked up by Brian was that there was a burial ground on the site, but he wasn't seeing it as being underneath the site we were on. Evidence suggests there is a Templar burial ground on the site, and it's thought to be beneath the tennis courts. There is evidence to suggest this is true, and it was picked up on the night. One of the things picked up in the room was an angry spirit. This was picked up by about 3 different groups, picked up at the same location. When asked various questions, we'd get a lot of activity with the glass, but 2 groups picked up on audible moans, groans, sighing, that kind of thing in that room. None of the groups talked about the experiences they'd had in the intervals or anything. The incident board, all the things that were written down were covered up. This is to kind of rule out suggestion. The angry spirit was actually picked up by one group twice in 2 locations. In the second location, we had a lot of activity involving a table, and the table actually came down onto my legs. Okay, another name that came up quite a lot was the name Charles. 2 groups picked up on the name Charles. One group linked it to Charles Vansittart. We've been back through the history of the property. Unfortunately, we cannot link the property to a Charles Vansittart. It's not to say he doesn't exist, it just says that we haven't found him if he did. Moving on to the Henry VIII and Elizabethan rooms, there was a lot of activity in these rooms picked up by several groups. One of the interesting things, there was a small door in the Henry VIII room which led up to the tower, and the tower room, and 3 groups picked up on the same sort of activity, and that was taps and bangs on the other side of the door. It actually leads to the staircase which goes up to the tower room, and this is where young William was thought to have died. Moving on to the Vansittart room, there was a lot of negative feelings picked up in this area, and that was picked up on by 3 groups, and these were sort of feelings of sadness, feeling uneasy, feeling anxious, feeling tense. 2 groups picked up on sadness, and 2 groups also had tears in their eyes whilst they were doing their vigils here. This is a very strange room, there's a lot of audio sort of activity. The most interesting thing was a correlation between 2 groups which involved lights within the room. One group picked up on a light over by the fireplace, and the other group picked up on a light in the centre of the room. It's interesting that both had the same phenomena occurring in the same room. Moving on to the Great Hall, this was where we did the automatic writing. We had some quite interesting things happen there. Paul's group was particularly interesting, and they connected with the child of a 4-year-old. The planchette was on top of the table, this planchette here as it goes was actually on top of the table, and they connected with this 4-year-old who claimed that the planchette was so high it was struggling to move it. 2 groups had the same thing happen in this room, and that was to do with the door at the end of the Great Hall. This door was opening and closing. Sure, Tim will probably tell you it was due to a draft. However, it was moving with a draft. However, on command, the door was actually opening really wide to its fullest extent, and then when it was reclosed, it was doing it again on command in response to questions. Tim will probably try and tell you how it was sort of it was a very windy night. The breeze outside was causing the air to go through, which is called Bernoulli's principle. However, the amount of air that was being dragged through that hallway would not have been enough to have opened that door to that extent, and particularly not on command. It could be coincidental, but the more it happened, it rules out the chance of coincidence. You can judge that on yourself. For me, the most interesting thing that we picked up on was actually something that Brian picked up on. This was of a man wearing a long red coat with a sword by his side, going by the name of George. This was in the Margaret Dickinson room, and to be honest, I didn't think too much of this at the time. However, going back through what other groups experienced and picked up on, someone else had the feeling of a spirit in a red coat. They described him as having a curly moustache and sort of wearing a sort of a military style hat. The time that this was linked to was around about the 1700s. However, the Van Start family were a naval family with a long history of admirals and so on, and quite high-ranking naval officers. However, going back through the history of the property, we did pick up on a military gentleman. It wasn't Colonel Mustard, however, it was George Henry Vansittart. He was a general in the British Army. And going back through various pieces of history, we looked into other generals of that sort of time period, and we found that General Wolfe, who died in Quebec a little bit earlier than General Vansittart was alive, actually was famous for wearing a long red coat, and lots of pictures of him do depict him wearing this, so it's highly probable that he would have worn a similar outfit at the time. So that to me is very interesting, in that George Vansittart has never been linked to the property that we know of. However, we picked up on him from two different people, and the description fits, and it goes against popular opinion of the family. I'm just going to leave you with this final bit, and it's to do with the things that Brian picked up on. Some of this actually blew me away. Brian was fantastic on the night. He came up with some absolutely brilliant, absolutely spot on things. One of the things he picked up on was the royal connection to Bisham Abbey. There is a lot of royal connection to the place. It was owned by Anne of Cleves. Elizabeth I visited there. In fact, Elizabeth I was imprisoned there. Brian picked up on the fact that it was used as a prison, and he actually said only special prisoners were his exact words. Elizabeth, Queen of Scots, who was the wife of Robert the Bruce, she was in prison there for 2 years before being moved. And this is another interesting thing that Brian picked up on. He picked up on Windsor Castle and a connection between Bisham Abbey and Windsor Castle. The connection was when Elizabeth of the Scots was moved, she was moved to Windsor Castle because it was more secure. Brian picked up on monks. He picked up on monks wearing white who were mistreated. When you think of monks, you tend to think of the long brown robe with a bit of rope tied around the middle. However, he picked up on monks wearing white robes. Benedictine monks are known for wearing white robes. Bisham Abbey was actually a property owned by the Benedictine monks. In 1537 they owned the property. So, is Bisham Abbey haunted? I'm going to leave that up to you to decide, but I think you need to hear from our very own Kieran O'Keefe on that subject.